I tell people we've sometimes helped good things happen, and we've often stopped bad things from happening. And it's not because we're so powerful, it's because information is powerful. We were already working on sort of a shoestring, and I just didn't see how I could do it. I needed a break, and it was the hardest decision I've ever made. And I still lie awake at night wondering whether it was a good decision or not.
What's happened to the record here in Canadian is not unique. Across the country, over the past 2 decades, more than 2,200 weekly newspapers have closed down, and tens of thousands of reporters have been laid off. And researchers say that not only has profound effects on the practice of journalism, but also on the country's civic health.
Local news is something that sort of reminds people of what they have in common, both their challenges and their shared identities, their shared culture, their shared community.
Joanna Dunaway is a professor and research director at Syracuse University's Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship. She says the broad decline of local newspapers nationally, driven largely by plummeting revenue as advertising moved online, has contributed to the rising polarization now seen across the country.
National news, for all of its many benefits, it tends to frame politics in America through the lens of the major conflicts between the two parties, right? And for those Americans or those citizens who are only watching the national news, they often only get this sort of game frame style coverage that it's almost like sports reporting.
Wendy Cook is the executive director of the Citadel Art Museum, a collection housed in a former Baptist church downtown. She moved here from Dallas years ago with her husband, who grew up in Canadian. In addition to the museum, she works as an interior designer and for the past 6 years has served on the city council. Without the paper, she worries that a level of accountability in local government will be lost.
I have a concern about who is telling the critical pieces of information. If the city is facing a bond election, who is giving the factual information about what that bond election is going to fund? Right now, without the Canadian record, I fear that our voter information is coming from our stuffed mailboxes, from candidates or from PACs, who by their very nature are providing biased material for our community.
Remarkable comments from members of the Canadian community, and I will never forget my conversation with a prominent rancher in the area, a man named Steve Rader, who praised the record, the Canadian record. He called it the glue that held the community together. He said because in its 46 pages or so every week, you saw the paper, he said it covered, and we know, it covered school board meetings, it reported on births, marriages, deaths, obituaries, the police blotter who had been arrested for speeding or something worse. He told me it had told the stories of his family, his children and his grandchildren's high school football games, softball games. He had tears in his eyes as he described how he didn't always agree with Lori Brown's editorials, she being a little to the left of him on some issues, but how he always appreciated her reporting and he always learned from it. And after seeing, I'll just give you 2 other quick examples. She saw that there were a number of accidents at a particular intersection just outside of town. She kept writing about it, and finally the county and the state put up a stoplight. She also noticed the community's need for a nursing home. Wrote about it, they did a ton of reporting about it, and eventually the community came together and built the nursing home. But in what happened to the Canadian record, we are seeing a scenario, yes, it's the Texas Panhandle, small town. This is playing out all across the country. Quietly, often out of the public eye. It's sad, but as you heard, it's much more than that. It is hurting our democratic system of government. As other residents of Canadian told me, and you heard it there from Ms. Cook, from Wendy Cook, the newspaper is gone, and so is the ability to hold local government accountable, local power centers accountable. So is that criticism, source of information. I just want to say the ability of people to just know what's going on in their own community, to hear about other people, to hear what other people are doing and thinking and saying, all of the things that affect people's lives. We did a separate report, I'll just mention, looking at efforts to revive local journalism around the country. Most of them philanthropic, nonprofit, as that was pulled together, and you're going to hear about that in a few minutes, by the Knight Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, initiative called Press Forward. There's another effort involved in all of this called the American Journalism Project, and still others. And other attempts to restart local journalism with a local advertising model, sometimes print, often digital. As you can imagine, there's a debate about whether these new local outlets, some of them hyper-local, focused on one small community, whether they should offer mainly news that people like to consume, like weather and sports, the local arts scene, lots of about community events, or whether they should expend more attention and resources doing investigative reporting, holding local officials, powerful people in the community accountable. The kind of journalism that won Mississippi Today, the startup in that state, a Pulitzer Prize for its investigation into corruption by the governor for diverting state welfare funds to a fitness center that was run by former football star Brett Favre. It made national news, you probably read about it. Well, some would say we need to do all of this, and I guess I lean in that direction. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. Cover the local issues that people are interested in and that people need to know, whether it's road closures and 5K races for charitable causes, we need to cover those, but we also need the hard looks at what the county commission, the school board, the zoning board, and so on are up to. And the same with a business model, where philanthropy can fill in the gap, we must support that. I believe we must support that. But if a business model can make it, I know we went to far western Virginia, to the community of Monterey. Maybe some of you are near there. We got to know Ann Adams, the publisher and editor of the Monterey Recorder, which she recently expanded a few months ago from Allegheny County to add Bath and Highland counties. She delivers the newspapers herself from one central location to another, grocery stores and other coffee shops. But as of last summer, she had found a way to hire a few new reporters. So I thought that was worth noting. But much more needs to be done, clearly. These are anecdotal efforts. They're important to share. And that's why we're here together this morning. I just want to say my hope, too, is that public media, which has already been for decades now an important feature of American journalism, can continue to play an important role, and a role that we believe is down the middle, centrist, listening to all, listening to people from all sides, trying to bring clarity, information, shine a light on the stories that are most important in your lives. I know that you are all here today to hear more about that. I'm going to be talking in a moment with two people on the panel, but I'm glad to take a few questions if you have any for a few minutes, and then I know you want to show a video to come after that. Any questions?
What role can the public, play in letting the news outlets know that we don't like the sensationalism, that we want the real facts?
By speaking up. The thing is, as you can imagine, in commercial media, what is watched are eyeballs for television, clicks for the internet, and the number of people who are listening on radio. And the more people who are watching, listening, following, clicking, that's what the response is to. And I will say, in public media, of course, we pay attention to audience. Audience matters, but it doesn't drive the work that we do. We care. We don't want people to turn us off. We're not here to be boring. We want to make the news as compelling and interesting as we can. But we are not driven. And having worked at NBC back in the 70s and 80s, at CNN in the 90s and the 00s, I know, I mean, for all the great work that is being done by many commercial outlets, and I will say I have many colleagues who work in commercial media. They're doing a fantastic job, working really, really hard. There is a commercial imperative. It is about clicks, eyeballs, number of followers, and that's how you get advertising. It's the business model. And that, you know, it's the American way, it's the capitalist way, and it's, you know, nothing against it, but when it comes to information that we need as people, and that information is disappearing before our very eyes because we can't sustain that business model, then we need to think about other solutions. We need to think about other ways. And again, I'm not saying people shouldn't watch what they enjoy or listen to or follow, but in addition to that, we need to make our elected representatives, the movers and shakers, if you will, understand that we want more. We are demanding more. We are demanding information, fact-checked information. Opinion is great. It's entertaining. It's important to hear what people feel and think, but we must have facts. We must have facts and information. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you so much for your remarks and your great career. How do you yourself handle it? What advice would you give to journalists when the subject of the interview is flatly lying, and not only flatly lying, but repetitively and rapidly lying? So it's very difficult to, you know, correct the record and check facts in the midst of the ferocious cavalcade of lies. So how do you address when your interview subject is lying, and how would you advise other reporters to do that?
Well, without characterizing what people are saying as lying, because to me, lying means you know what someone's motivation is and that they know what they're saying is wrong and they're saying it anyway. I think we have to allow what some of what is being said is what people believe. It's what they think based on what they know. There are others that they're knowingly not telling the truth. It's hard. The answer is it's hard. We have not, in all my 50 plus years of reporting, I haven't been through a period like this one where respected political leaders, people who are out in public life, have been elected to office, are in a place where they're sharing information which is not vetted and not accurate. And if you have an hour or two with someone, you can sit and debate with them. You can not even debate, you can say, well, this is what the law says, or this is what the person said, and quote someone and cite. But if you've only got a 7 or 8 minute interview, it's hard to challenge everything they're saying. I mean, I think it's hard. I don't have a formula for doing that. Because on the one hand, I think we have to listen to people across the political spectrum. We have to go out and talk to political leaders from all the way to the left, all the way to the right, and everything in between. That's our job if we're covering a story, or trying to understand an issue. And when people are misrepresenting the facts, what we think is knowingly, I don't think we as reporters can assume that someone is deliberately lying. We have to assume that maybe they've just gotten it wrong. And so there's a way to work it into your question and say, well, I understand what you just said, but the facts show the numbers crossing the border were X or Y. And that they may argue with you. And then you have to make a decision. Do I want this whole 7 minute interview to be a debate about what the facts are? Or do you want to move on? You just want to say, my information is different from yours, and then move on to the next question. If it's a television interview, if it's a newspaper interview, you've got more time, or a print interview, I should say, off camera, you've got more time, it's different. But every reporter has to make those tough decisions. We are in a different period now where, thanks to digital and all the wonderful technological changes that have happened, people can access information, they can quote information, they can look at a piece of information and come away with 2 completely different sets of conclusions. And that makes it harder for the press. Yes?
If you're talking about a nonprofit model, so if I'm wearing Charlotte's undersettlement nonprofit news outlets, it kind of creates a sense of scarcity of funding, and so there's a competitive problem between the outlets? How do you recommend reporters, journalists, organizations, public and private work together to protect and disseminate the news? How can they collaborate instead of?
It's, I am hesitant, extraordinarily hesitant to step into or weigh in on what's going on in Charlottesville or any other community where there's more than one news organization. First of all, I would say bless them for what they're doing. We need them. Thank goodness people are out there trying to cover the news. That's number one. Number two, competition is at the heart, in many ways, of journalism. We're all about, we want to get to the story and we want to get it first. But we should be driven more than anything else by wanting to get it right. And so if there's a way to work together, then, you know, I would say talk to the folks involved, see if they can do that. But it may be a situation where if there are 2 or 3 or more, where you just have to see, you know, which model is the most viable, and for whatever reason, maybe one has a stronger base. I don't know enough to weigh in to make a comment. But it is the American. I mean, it's good news to me, first of all, that you've got 3 who are trying to cover the news in Charlottesville. That's great news. I wish more communities around the country had that problem. And I would hope that they could have conversations with one another if there's truly overlap. It may be that they find that each one has a slightly different mission. Maybe one is doing more investigative work, one is doing something different. I don't know. But I'm all about sitting down and talking things through and trying to find ways to find common ground, which is another reason I find today's political atmosphere extraordinarily frustrating.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Holly Hatcher, and I have the honor of leading the Anne and Jean Royal Foundation. In addition to the informative and inspiring panel discussion we're going to get to in just a few moments, the Planning Committee wanted to highlight several terrific organizations that are providing new models in Virginia. They are meeting the needs and showing the love, thank you, Michael, of our communities. As we will see, philanthropy has a critical role to play in sustaining and growing Virginia's local news ecosystem. Not only the organizations you'll see in the film, the organizations that we couldn't fit in the film, and the organizations we hope that you will help your communities create. Special thanks to Lighthouse Studio, a Charlottesville nonprofit that equips young people with the skills and confidence to tell their own stories through filmmaking. They created this film for us, and we will share it with you afterward in hopes that you will keep the learning going. Enjoy the film.
The WHRO is a public media organization that covers the Hampton Roads region. We provide educational services for the entire state. We now have 5 TV stations, 5 radio stations. We're doing humanities work. And of course, our newsroom started up about 4 years ago.
DCIJ is a statewide investigative journalism newsroom.
A few years ago, we had the opportunity to merge and to become part of the WHRO family.
We focus on statewide issues that'll have an impact. We recently did a series with ProPublica that looked at public universities and their acquisition of land. The General Assembly approved a measure to form a study commission to look into what has happened in Black communities around public universities.
We launched Cardinal News in the fall of 2021 to tell the stories of Southwest and Southside Virginia. Stories weren't being told anymore about these communities simply because of where they live.
In Patrick County, they've been without healthcare services for about 5 years now. Covering that situation has helped the local government as well as community members.
VPM News reporter Megan Pauley did an extensive series on student debt. Her reporting on that topic led to specific, direct changes at the legislative level.
After August 12th, 2017, not only Charlottesville, but the world needed to see collaboration. That's the nucleus of what brought these 3 entities together under CIM. You have a legacy media organization in Charlottesville tomorrow. You have a historic organization started as a newsletter that became digital media in Vinegar Hill. And then you have radio and podcast, which is In My Humble Opinion.
We had a tent community had sprung up in the middle of Charlottesville. This story that we did that highlighted the perspectives of the people who were living in that community and why they lived there is influencing the way the city is approaching this issue.
The biggest project that we had was the Determined series, focused on the non-medical and medical factors that contribute to community wellness and health.
First Person Seville, we had a young lady, she's been wheelchair bound since she was a child. Her and her family actually received emails and calls from our local government wanting to know what can they do to make life better for her and like individuals.
Foothills Forum is a nonprofit, community-supported journalism organization that works with the local weekly, the Rappahannock News, and we supply stories and graphics and video that helps them as they produce their weekly paper.
We have a robust news and information enterprise that is focused on public service in this region, up and running. Now let's grow it.
I think Central Virginia deserves a newsroom of 30 people, 30 journalists, an organization of 50. I get like 100 emails a day. And the hardest thing we do every day is deciding what important thing not to cover.
Every week I'll get an email from mothers in Lynchburg concerned about what's happening in the public schools. People in North Carolina concerned what's happening at the state government level. These are places that we can't get to because we simply don't have the reporters to do that.
If I could wave a magic wand and it could be whatever I like, we would have more journalists on the ground working at a local level.
We keep being asked to do more as Legacy keeps contracting. I mean, the number of the communities we cover now don't even have a daily paper. So we have a new 5-year plan, and we have just decided that we will be, that old-fashioned term, the paper of record for our region.
We want to get people in the community. We're thinking like a community cohort to learn about journalism. And how do we build a cohort for people to learn and be able to practice their skills using our platforms.
I think the question before all of us is, what is the future business model for news? Sitting in public media, I think we actually have a good answer for that, and it comes from philanthropic and individual giving. People valuing journalism and local news as important to keeping the community strong, for them to understand their communities and their neighbors, and giving money to support that.
We're so appreciative of the importance that our funders have placed on building information and news for everyone.
When you have a strong team of local journalists, they can go in with community knowledge and grab somebody's life experience and hear their story and add some context to it that can really make a difference.
I think that we're going to continue to innovate, and we're going to create things that are really going to change the landscape of what media looks like, not just in Charlottesville and the region, but in the country.
Nonprofit journalism is the business model that increasingly foundations will have an obligation to support local news operations. It's that critical to having well-informed communities.
What journalists do makes a difference. And time again, story after story, it's changing the world.
So philanthropy has traditionally supported institutions like arts and culture institutions, maybe museums or colleges and universities that are certainly the bedrock of our society. But journalism hasn't been valued in that same way. And what you see happening now is the for-profit model for journalism collapsing. And when that happens, local newspapers across this country are dying. And if you look at data will show that communities that don't have newspapers are more polarized, citizens are not engaged, maybe citizens don't actually vote, and no one's holding truth to power. So then the question is, who's going to hold those democratic institutions together? So I believe that news should be worthy of those larger philanthropic gifts, because if we're not giving to news and news institutions, then we might not have those other institutions that we're used to giving to. They might not be there anymore.
Doug Blue is with the Knight Foundation. He is the Director of Sustainability Initiatives at the Knight Foundation. Lizzie Hazeltine is the Director of the North Carolina Local News Lab Fund. I want to make sure I get your titles right. It's great to see both of you. They're both amazing. We're lucky to have them here. Doug, let me start with you. tell me how you and the work that you're doing, how all of you see the state of local journalism right now.
Thank you, Judy, and I should call you Mrs. Woodruff.
My
mother told me that I have to call you Mrs. Woodruff because in her words, you've earned it. She's a Vietnamese immigrant, and so Grant Maker is not something that's in her vocabulary. But when she heard I was being interviewed by Judy Woodruff, she was like, okay, this makes sense. So thank you. So at night, let me just start with what I think with the state of where things are when it comes to local news and media environment. And you hit upon it in your opening remarks. I think it's a fact of the world that the media ecosystem has been in a bear market for at least the last 25 years. From the dot-com bust to the great financial crisis, to the rise of the social media companies and technologies that are disintermediating the relationships between news organizations and the consumers, to the pandemic itself, each one of those has marked a lower low when it comes to what's happened in this news ecosystem that we all care about. And that's one fact of the world. And I would say that the other fact of the world is that in that same time, in your lived experience, I doubt anyone in your life would tell you that they do not think they have enough information. I doubt anyone in your life looking at would tell you, like, what are you talking about? I am swimming in information. I'm overwhelmed with it. It is everywhere I look. It comes to me. And so those are two facts of the world that we're living in, where like the hollowing out of this news ecosystem, the tens of thousands of journalists, thousands of newspapers, news organizations have been hollowed out, decimated, and yet people feel they are overwhelmed with information. That's the state of where we're living in. And in particular, the hardest hit part of this has been the local news ecosystems, those weekly papers, those community papers that have been essential to informing and engaging communities throughout this country's history. And what has filled that vacuum has been national news organizations that have not had the same kind of economic incentives to bring communities together in the same way that local news organizations do. They do not have those same economic incentives. They are meant to polarize. They are meant to tear people apart. That is what the economic model is. And so, I think it's interesting about the world that I want to say that this is hard. This is not hopeless. And as a result of what we are trying to do with Press Forward and what we are trying to do with Knight Foundation is to revive that business model for local news. And we can talk about some of the philanthropic efforts that I think we're doing nationally and what I hope we can bring to Virginia in the next several years.
Lizzie Hazeltine, before we get to Press Forward and what you're doing, describe the local news situation in the state of North Carolina, right next door, just south of Virginia.
Certainly. So, hello, neighbors. It's good to be with you. Thank you for the invitation to talk about the ways that our geographies overlap, our cultures overlap, and many of our news organizations overlap. As you heard in the video, North Carolina and South Carolina, South Carolina by birth, it comes out sometimes. We have so much in common. Our rural populations and their needs, the growth of our cities, huge in-migration, the growth of major industries, the necessity of economic development, and also the political economies and where we find ourselves not only in the South but in the country. I'm seeing some nodding. So one of the things that Duck has talked about and sketched out this kind of funny inverse curve that we're living with. What amounts to, in many ways, the death of an old system, market failure at scale in local news and in national news, which has led to the nationalization of local coverage and the loss of clarity, the loss of the through line between our individual stakes, our neighbors' stakes, and our community stakes, and the stuff that we are living through in a variety of different ways, whether that's hurricanes, whether that's climate change, whether that's a local election, whether that's a presidential election. And also these spots of hope, these seedlings, saplings of what is a new system that's rooted in community needs, that's rooted in what people need to know on a random Tuesday morning to do life. And also how to make sense of a succession of Tuesday mornings where the same thing keeps happening over and over again. All of that adds up in some ways, y'all, to a story of us, and that is one of the things that we're working really hard on in North Carolina. Expanding reporting,
Reporters, reporting, journalists, and journalism are essential. We must have corroborated, factual, high-quality information to put out to people. And we have to put it out to people. We have to reach people where they are, on the channels they're using, with people and messengers that they trust. And that's going to take all of us, and that's going to take a wide variety of organizations. And then, as I mentioned before, we have to tell a complete story of us. Some of that will be painful. Some of that will mean we will disagree in public, which is not very Southern of us, but is absolutely necessary. And it also means that we're going to have a chance to celebrate the things that are going right and amplify them and build on them and understand that this is a mixed bag and that is part of our shared humanity. So I think that's the message I want to bring from North Carolina, just a state north, is that it's hard, as Doug said, but it is neither impossible nor is it not concretely already in motion. That there are not just things to identify, problems to very clearly articulate, but there are ways to intervene. There are ways to get more reporters on the beat. There's ways to make sure that people, regardless of where they live in your state, can get the news and information they need to thrive, and then also to make sure that we're telling a complete story of us.
So let's talk about that. Doug, the need, I mean, we've described it. The gap out there is enormous. It's enormous. It's in every state. It's in virtually every community in the country where we've seen the collapse of traditional journalism. How does Press Forward and what you all are doing attempt to fill in some of that gap?
So Press Forward, and part of the reason why I'm here today, is a national movement designed to galvanize funders to look at local news as an important institution and a public good that is worthy of consideration, worthy of fundraising for, worthy of speaking to communities about, in order to ensure that we are serving our communities well. I ask any of you, do any of your strategies for community outcomes rely on people being informed about what's happening? Does it rely on people not being apathetic about what's happening in their communities? Does it rely on them working together and seeing each other as neighbors and not just as people who are on the opposite side of the rail? If it requires that, then we need a strategy as well for how to bring people together in a way where they see each other, where their points of view are informed, and they see each other as people, and their points of view, not just of themselves, but of their neighbors, are also things that they're considering. Why is Press Forward focused on local news? We've talked about what's happening with national media. That is not what this is about. We are not engaging in that debate. This is about local news, and it's about serving our communities in a way, and part of the thesis for that is because I fundamentally believe that local news and information is one key element of breaking our political identities. It is one way into breaking apart polarization, partly because local news is a heck of a lot easier to verify in our communities than it is in national media, right? We do reporting on what's happening at the border, and people in Virginia are not going to have any way of verifying that. It's not meant for them. It's not meant for you to make decisions on. But the local news about what's happening with your schools and your roads, that's stuff that you can see with your own eyes and hopefully find a way to come together to work to solve that. So, what is Press Forward meant to do? I think it's ultimately a way to change habits. That's how I think about it. We're trying to change the habits of funders who have not funded journalism in the past to see local news as something that's worthy of consideration in the same ways that we talk about museums, colleges, and the arts programs. This is fundamental and a part of our communities. We're trying to change the habits of funders to fund it and also to work together. And that's something that Dale and the staff at Press Forward are trying to work us, are trying to push us to do as well, is that how can we actually work together to do exactly what we're trying to do here, to have collective impact by working collaboratively, to identify where the gaps are when it comes to local news coverage in our communities, and also funding together in order to ensure that we're giving these news organizations the runway, the down payments that they need to create quality, essential journalism that is relevant to the communities, so that those communities see the value in it and are able to help sustain it alongside your efforts. And so, what is this? What have we done so far? We've raised more than $500 million across dozens and dozens of foundations. I think we're up to closing on 60 or so foundations that are part of this. And each of those foundations, as part of Press Forward, are funding across 4 different key areas. One is funding newsrooms who have shown demonstrated trust and demonstrated trust for their communities. We are funding what we call the enabling infrastructure of this media ecosystem. And those are all the things that newsrooms need to go and report the news, from the content management systems that get their sites up on the web, to the legal funds that are necessary for them to go get the news and to report on it, even in the face of public officials who would want to keep that information secret. We are trying to close racial inequities and other gaps when it comes to our coverage of the news and when it comes to representation in the media. And finally, we're looking at funding efforts to help galvanize public policy solutions that can ensure that policymakers look at news and information in their communities as also a public good as well. And there's some really interesting initiatives there from California to New York to Chicago to Albuquerque and New Mexico. There are really interesting efforts there, and I think Virginia has also a really exciting opportunity to lead it there. And finally, the last thing I'll say about Press Forward is that there are going to be 3 fundamental ways of engaging with this initiative as a funder. One is what we call as a national aligned funder. One is going to be putting dollars into a pooled fund that Dale Anglin over here would be more than happy to talk to you about, who heads up Press Forward. And the last is around starting up a local chapter, which Lizzie here in North Carolina is representative of, and locally working together, again, identifying gaps, helping make funding decisions, helping set strategies, helping ensure the sustainability of your local news ecosystem for the state of Virginia. And I really want to say that the Virginia Local News Lab Fund has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?
We'll be happy to share branding tips later.
So excuse me, Lizzie, tell us what exactly is the North Carolina Local News Lab Fund? What is it? How did it come into being? And how do you do your job?
So we're a pooled fund. So we don't have an endowment. We are a coalition of funders that we have built both with local funders, national funders, and in our local funders, we've got everybody from community foundations, healthcare conversion funds, statewide funders, you name it, we have partners across the different types of foundations. And what we do is we invest together in a systems approach to ensuring that everybody in North Carolina can find, trust, and use the news and information we all need. So that approach takes into account those roles that I talked about earlier. The reporting, the distribution, and then also the narrative work. And we got our start because these funders fundamentally saw that if they wanted to get done what they wanted to get done in communities, if they wanted to make sure that everybody from Corolla up to Catawba had what they needed, then we needed to have a long list of organizations that would work together. Not because saving news was the thing we were after, but because specifically we wanted communities to be well served. And we understood from the jump that we were going to have to learn as we went, building on the starting point for us, which was an ecosystem study done by Fiona Morgan and Melanie Sill back in 2016 into 2017. So what they did was gave us a really interesting and useful snapshot of what's working, what's missing, who's here, and who's not yet in the picture. And that starting point, it's a report called Learning from North Carolina. You can find it on our site, nclocalnews.org. Is a really good picture of, again, what assets could we build on? Because in North Carolina, we have, like in Virginia, we have a long history of independent press. We have a long history of family-owned newspapers who are largely county-based weeklies. That's great. And we also saw that there were a lot of different other players in public media, in commercial media, and also other trusted messengers who were filling in gaps where people were never well served by commercial media. We know that's true. Rural folks, poor folks, folks who speak and read a language other than English at home, people who are not here as U.S. citizens, on and on down the list. We know that race and class inflect media systems like they do all the systems that we live with. So we had a chance to think about what might we start, what might we try, what do we need to learn first, and we began investing together, partners from Democracy Fund as well as local North Carolina foundations, and we started learning together. And we started unpacking what we saw was working and then also figuring out what else we needed to do next. I will say, Judy, that the COVID-19 pandemic made a very clear through line for funders in North Carolina between people's health, well-being, and safety, and the news and information they did or didn't have at any given point. So that was a real and to work together and frankly to create some efficiencies and a little bit of a, jokingly say, an easy button. A pooled fund is a vehicle, infrastructure, shared staffing in order to get something done where people don't have to go to a board level to get an approval to start a journalism vertical and then get smart about it and then do some studies. We all know how that goes, right? And there's gulping happening across the room, which I can see, right? You heard the urgency in what Judy has shared and also what Duck has outlined. That urgency and the people that we serve really can't wait, so a pooled fund has been an exigent vehicle to get moving and get the dollars moving and get the people served with the news and information they need.
So important to hear your own experience. Doug, back to you on how do you make decisions and press forward about, you touched on this, about what's working, who's trusted in the community. How do you make decisions about where you're going to put your money? And what do you look for in terms of when you create a collaborative collaborative arrangement? What has to be in place for that to work?
So many things. But I would say, so there are three mechanisms by which Press Forward will be distributing the dollars that I've talked about. Okay, so reiterating them. One is what we're calling aligned funding. Okay, these are funders who still go through the same processes of answerable to our boards, answerable to our stakeholders internally, and the same due diligence and vetting that we do for any single dollar that goes out our doors. That is aligned funding, but working together. And these are national funders who are deciding to work together and to say, hey, this is one piece of this that fits into our strategy pretty squarely. This is a piece of it when it comes to what you guys are doing that might fit better. I'll give you one example about that. At Knight Foundation, for example, we generally do not fund directly many newsrooms. Let me just say, with the fact about Virginia, for example, because I live here, in the state of Virginia, okay, and this will be the example where I think there could be something here. But in the state of Virginia, I think the literacy rate of this state hovers around 80–85%. The population of Virginia is closing in on about 9 million people, right? That means that there are probably around 1 million people in this state, and growing, that are not well served by the fact that the artifact of media is an 800-word print article, right? That is meant to be written at a 12th grade level, and they're not being well served by this ecosystem. There are players, as Lizzie would say, in North Carolina, and other places that are finding new ways of reaching those kinds of people, right, that are not well served by this English-speaking, text-based form of media that are going through in WhatsApp, in text messages, and other ways of reaching people, right? And I look at that and I say, that's interesting. There's an emerging group of some flowers that are blooming that are finding different ways of getting news and information into hard-to-reach communities. I think that there are organizations out there, funders out there, that should be well served by giving them financial runway in order to actually figure out what the business model looks like in order for monetizing that, and again, serving those audiences. Knight Foundation would be interested in the infrastructure of that. What does it look like to have technology vendors, to have cohorts together, to have learning communities put in place that would also serve and support that kind of community? Organizations like us, right, that would look at this problem, right, look at these things and say, I would do this part of it, I would do this part of it, and together we can make a huge impact by giving that part of the media ecosystem something really important and some really interesting runway and techniques for actually going out and doing the thing. So that is one way that national aligned funders are working together in order to make that work. There's a pool fund, and that is literally all the news and media at this point that Dale Anglin over there, Executive Director of Press Forward, just put together and put out the first RFP that is meant to serve community that will get grants of up to $100,000 to newsrooms with budgets of less than $1 million that are serving their communities. And that pool fund is up and running right now. And it will continue to have other RFPs and other ways of distributing money from this pool fund that is being decided within Press Forward and the staff there. The last group, and really where I think all the excitement and where the energy is at these days, and the reason why I'm going on the road to Wichita and Lexington and Albuquerque and Baltimore and Charlotte, and the reason why we're doing that is because we are trying to establish press forward local chapters. That is a third way, and I think fundamentally the way that I would love to see Virginia being a leader in this. We really should not let North Carolina be the only state in this part of the country that has this. We really should not. We need to find our Lizzie. We need to find our Lizzie. We'll do real work of working us together. We need to find our Lizzie. And we need to have a Virginia Press Forward Fund that will look at this and will work together in order to ensure that we are identifying the needs of Virginians and working together in order to make sure that our news needs are being served. So local press forward chapters are being set up. Those funds from local are being subsidized by someone with national. And they're working together again in order to strategize, fundraise, and do grants and continue to be sustainable. And so I hope that one of the artifacts of Press Forward, one of the remnants of Press Forward, that even after this 5-year initiative is up, there will still be funds for local journalism continuing onwards because of how important they see local journalism is for their communities. So those are 3 ways that we're evaluating and getting dollars out the door.
So you've heard us say how competitive journalism can be. It can be competitive in this way too. Lizzie, you got to defend yourself.
Look, defensiveness is the way to death. So there is no reason why you need a Lizzie. You need someone who's going to wake up thinking about Virginia and Virginians and Virginia residents every day, who's going to send the doodle poll, who's going to call the meeting, who has the Zoom license, and has a reliable car to get around. Truth. My little Volvo is parked in the valet. I'm grateful for her. But what I want to build on what Doug has offered and the very generous flattery he's also put on now a statewide platform is that you've got for collaborations to work, you've got to be clear about who it's for. Ultimately, who is this for? And that's your point of convening. You can start it around the theme, you can start it around the geography, you can start it around a whole dang state if you want. Pick a person, a people, communities, and get clear about who you're for first, and then you can get into the how. The how is, for us as funders, fundamentally about grant making. We're going to move some money. We're going to make some grants. And you can start thinking about what form you want those grants to take. Often an easy entry point or an easier or a clearer entry point when you're starting to fund local news is to fund a beat reporter like you've seen in the video just now. And you can ladder up from that to, well, okay, yes, reporting is great, absolutely necessary, and it's not everything it takes to run a sustainable business. You also need somebody to do the bookkeeping, and you need somebody to host a community engagement event. So general operating funding is also essential as you ladder up and as you learn more as funders and you can make flexible funding available. But what else do people need? People also need somebody to wake up in the morning and call the meeting and send the doodle for the news ecosystem too. Just like the FN has called the meeting and sent the doodle and gotten us all in the room today. All of that is really essential for weaving the networks which create resilience and start lowering those competitive barriers. If we see who we have in common and the goals we have in common, we can start standing shoulder to shoulder instead of looking at each other and looking at the one funder that we'd all like to pitch and say, okay, let's go. We can look out at the community and say, okay, yeah, let's go in that different way, which is a fundamental frame shift in a community and audience-centric vision. So again, just to summarize, if you want to be less competitive, if you want to encourage less competitiveness, put community at the center and the many different actors it takes to serve them all in the same room, and use your funder power to convene people around that goal. Second, think about what ways you can have efficiencies both for yourselves as funders and for the grant seekers who will want this support to staff to create the network weaving that you need. And then also think about specifically like what kind of a collaborative person, what kind of an open-handed, wide perspective person do you want waking up thinking about this every day? And again, funding that role because it's creating the infrastructure for all this other goodness that's going to flow from having that focus.
I think we only have about a minute now. We have 5 minutes. Okay, we're going a little bit over, a few minutes over. Lizzie, I was told to ask you this. Many grant makers, and we want to turn to all of you for our final few minutes, by the way. If you've got questions, this is your chance to pose them. There is a QR code up there. You can submit your questions. I'll see them on this laptop. and I can read them, or we can have you stand up, whatever's easier. But to Lizzie right now, many grant makers are place-based. How do you create a pooled fund that supports a collective approach beyond an individual funder's service region?
Certainly, you can do a lot of really creative and agile mixing and matching, right? In our 9-funder coalition, we have national funders, we have statewide funders, from like Blue Shield of North Carolina Foundation, Eastern Reynolds Foundation, KP Reynolds Charitable Trust. We also have Dogwood Health Trust, a healthcare conversion fund that specifically earmarked their money for the 14 westernmost counties in North Carolina. I can tell you right now that when you open a call for media funding to inform communities, you are going to get very quickly a snapshot of who sees themselves in that work if you frame your RFP expansively. It's not hard to find people who are doing work in specific geographies and allocate funding to where there is service to be done. That's one of the advantages of having one call instead of having 7 different calls or 9 different calls in the case of these 9 different funders. We can get a snapshot, we can have a deep and wide pool, and then we can work with our funding coalition to make sure that dollars are in alignment with the agreements they have with their donors, with their endowment paperwork, all of these things that we know are just part of how we work. You can absolutely work with that. And also, I know that there are some community foundations in the room. Community foundations, we know that we have a lot of assets sometimes, and not as much flexibility with how we apply them, right? Just these kind of flexible dollars can be hard to come by. There are also other entry points for you from your comms budget. Also in terms of doing ecosystem research, even in light touch ways, to get a sense of how you might support organizations that are doing good work in farming communities. So lots of ways. Come see me after, we can get into granular detail.
You heard her say that. Come see her after. We've got 4 questions already. Now let's see if we can get to them very quickly. And I just want to say for the first one, here we go. And as a mother of a son with disabilities, I really appreciate this one. And this touches on something you just mentioned. How can we break down language barriers and increase disability access in reporting? There's a gap in including those voices.
Yeah.
Keep it short, because we've got 3 other questions.
So there's a trade association, I'm blanking on the name, there's a trade association for that, for journalism with disabilities. And it's also something that that journalists, one, we have to be more representative of that space and find ways to include them. That's 100%. We also can find ways to create news and information, and I'm hopeful, this is where I do a lot of hand waving in terms of like getting from point A to point B, but that is new ways of actually creating and working using artificial intelligence and other ways of doing that. We can actually be a lot more efficient about creating different ways of consuming information than we have before, and that hopefully that will be a way of getting it into the hands of folks who have traditionally not been well served by it. We have done a great job of it, and I'm hopeful that with this focus on particularly where we're going to press forward and what we're going to do to close some of these gaps, journalists will have some of the funding that they need to actually do that work well and bring those communities into this, and for them to see that journalism is actually a place for them to belong, and for them a place to be seen and to be heard. So I would say that. I don't have a good answer in terms of like what, I do have some specific things in terms of like where, but in terms of like a general answer, I think we've got to do it, and this funding is part of the way, but part of the answer.
Here's another question. What role does community radio and Substack newsletters play in local journalism? Most are volunteer community members stepping in to fill those gaps. Lizzie, thoughts on that?
Yes, so we use the word ecosystem for a reason. There are lots of different actors. You have your charismatic megafauna, you have your predators, you have your bottom feeders, you have things that are dead and dying. You get my point. I am not characterizing Substack authors or in a normative way and saying they're bottom feeders. They're not. What you see, and what I see when I look at these people who jump in where they see a need, is activation energy. And often what you have there is also sweat equity. So what I see when I see those are additions to the ecosystem and new growth. Now, not all new growth is great, and there are some of these, again, I think, Judy, you touched on good faith, bad faith, and like how do we discern the difference? It's good to help people understand the basics of corroborating information, being transparent about your funding sourcing. it's an opportunity, honestly, in many ways, but they're part of a broader system that is kind of chaotic and grows in unpredictable ways, and we have to understand that as part of what exists.
Here's a question from Matt, and Doug, I'm going to turn to you. Do you have experience funding local newspapers that no longer have local ownership, but rather out-of-state conglomerate ownership?
We do not have experience with funding those. We do not. We at night, for example, and at Press Forward, we intend to fund for-profits. We do not intend to fund hedge funds. And I think that is a clear dividing line that we can make in terms of independent local ownership that cares about community, that wants to be able to hold their heads up high as they walk around their neighbors. That is not something that happens when you have out-of-state is wrong, but when you have owners who do not feel that level of community involvement. And that's one of the reasons why I want, where local chapters are so important in verifying this, because you all know your communities. You all know the people who care about it and are invested in it and want to see it made better. And giving us that feedback when we make mistakes is something that we want to hear. But as a general rule, we will fund for-profits. We will not fund hedge funds.
Question. Do you have examples of engaging and creating a pipeline from youth education and programming up through the professional level?
Yes, and youth media is such an important part of an ecosystem, right? And youth media, not because we're just training them to be journalists, but because in many cases, youth media or student media are already filling the roles of professional journalists. University journalism, student journalism is journalism, full stop. I think about the Daily Tar Heel in Chapel Hill and the excellent coverage that they continue to provide to a university town that doesn't have someone on the beat from the News and Observer, right? It's necessary, they're doing excellent work. And what we also see is like journalism as a career path is highly professionalized, and that journalism school itself is very expensive. There's a fraught path between learning how to do a podcast as a 12-year-old at camp because your public media station hosts it, to being a beat reporter at a commercial paper. That path is changing and shifting all the time. One of the things that is really helpful for a healthy ecosystem is to ensure that many different people of different ages get to tell their stories in their own words. So investing in youth media, convening youth media, supporting people who train youth and understanding that as a valuable contribution to news and information and the system at large is already a part, like pipeline aside. And we also fund some additional capacity building and supports to help different stages of career journalists meet with each other and feel less alone. Because that's also, as you've heard about the contraction and the challenge in being a journalist right now and feeling under attack and being at risk, truly at risk, physically and otherwise in many ways. Connecting to each other is also a way to help maintain people's sanity, help them feel more like they've got a thing to hold on to together.
Just want to make one more clarion call for student journalists, and Lizzie is so right about this. It's about creating that pipeline to get students from point A to point B, but also when they're in schools, what a valuable resource student journalists are. I'm convicted of this belief. We made a significant grant. This is breaking news. It's not really breaking news. We made a grant in March. We're getting a grant agreement signed. It's with the University of Vermont to help fund efforts to understand the landscape of what we call university and local news partnerships. These are when universities have some kind of editor, some kind of professor working, editing student reporters who are doing work outside of the four walls of the university, and then working with the local newsrooms and having those communities, having those universities be true community centers for organizing and understanding the local news ecosystems and working with newsrooms to get student reporters outside of the four walls of the university. What I would say there is that in the last Northwestern Medill local news research on news deserts, there were somewhere around 1,700 or so news deserts. The University of Vermont, in its initial planning grant with Knight, found that there are currently about 130 or so university local news partnerships around this country. Okay? 1,700 news deserts, about 130 or so university local news partnerships. In those 1,700 counties that I just talked about, there's a university either within or adjacent to about 1,200 of those. So what I look for is like, well, there's room to really move the needle here. If we were able to activate universities and get from 130 to 250 to 500, we can really make a dent when it comes to local news deserts, and also giving students a great opportunity to practice real journalism before they go out into the workplace.
Thank you all for great questions.
Good morning, everyone. If you could just bear with me for 2 seconds, I know we're over time, and then we're keeping you from coffee and snacks and the deep dives. But just 2 seconds. My name is Matthew Gibson. I'm the Executive Director of Virginia Humanities, which is the Commonwealth's Humanities Council. First and foremost, join me, please, in thanking our stellar and brilliant speakers, Judy Woodruff. And just a few more comments. We'll keep you, I promise. So Duck and Judy and Lizzie have really provided us, I think, with a better understanding of the challenges that are facing today's model, or actually yesterday's models of journalism, but also showing us what the opportunities are for today's and tomorrow's models, which are actually mostly nonprofit models of journalism. So I'm going to thank them for that. And just, I also want to take this opportunity to thank the planning committee for this amazing panel, and also to the VFN staff. Without them, we could not have made this happen. And just a quick logistical note, if you're checking out early, or checking out after this, you can store your bags in the Rappahannock room, just next door. But back to local journalism real quick. No matter the specific topic discussed, I believe the thread of this conference, the thread of all of our work, is community well-being. Or as Michael put it so eloquently, community love. After all, what is philanthropy? But thinking of its Greek etymological origins, an expression of human loving. See, that is what the use of the humanities is all about right there, right? The etymology. I told you, Mom. So why should we care about the fate of local journalism in this context? Well, in short, without an informed community, you've already heard this, you cannot have a healthy community. And by healthy, I mean whole health. Social, intellectual, physiological, psychological, and environmental. As Doug suggested, journalism underpins each and every philanthropic priority represented here in this room. What we know about housing, about climate, education, medical health issues, comes from a reliable and vibrant information ecosystem. These funding priorities of ours become more challenged and challenging to address, and the environment in which we work becomes more precarious without that information ecosystem. As our speakers have made very clear, for new journalism models to survive and flourish, philanthropy is critical. And as philanthropists all in this room, I want you to consider taking just a few actions. First and foremost, the most immediate step is to come to the journalism deep dive and exploration at 10:30 in James River B, where Michael Bolden will be joined by Dale Anglin, the director of Press Forward, to talk about, I know we've got like stars galore here, to talk about what it might take collectively here in Virginia to sustain and grow journalism at the local level. And Virginia's not new to this collective action. Last year alone, funding by the Claude Moore Charitable Foundation, the Danville Regional Foundation, the PATH Foundation, the Harvest Foundation, and the Wellspring Foundation of Southwest Virginia was all pulled together to support a healthcare reporter at Cardinal News. You saw her, Emily Schabacker, who was in the video earlier. Pretty amazing. But that's just the tip of the iceberg of what needs to be done. Second, if you care about local journalism, if you read your local paper, fund it. Third and finally, Virginia Humanities and the Carson Institute of Democracy at the University of Virginia will be hosting a journalism summit in Charlottesville in early October later this year. We actually had one in April last year in Richmond, our inaugural conversation. But our goal with this summit is actually to maintain and grow the momentum here, which we hope to build, around philanthropic foundations to consider what creating a collaborative funding environment for the future of news here in the state might look like. So get on board. Without further ado, again, thanks to Judy, thanks to Lizzie, thanks to Doug, and the entire planning staff.